Remember the outrageous Plymouth Superbird? Well, this is where it all started. Hi there, Rick DeBrule with another chapter in the automotive evolution. Once again, I'm here at the Martin Auto Museum, and as you can see behind me, it's a great collection. In total, more than 170 cars that really span the full automotive spectrum and tell all kinds of wonderful stories about the automotive journey. And this particular car, this car right here, this 1928 Plymouth Model Q, is a very important part because this car represents the roots of Plymouth in the automobile world. But first, make sure you like and subscribe, and in the comments down below, let me know what I got right, what I got wrong. There's always something I get wrong. And tell me your favorite Plymouth story. For example, the first car I remember as a kid riding around in was a 1949 Plymouth. We called it the Blue Brute, but I digress. Let's talk about the business of this car right here, this 1928 Plymouth Model Q. In the mid-1920s, Ford and Chevy had some solid, dependable family cars. Chrysler felt it was missing out. You see, Walter P. Chrysler really made a name for himself by building powerful, refined cars under the Chrysler badge. But he saw a gap. Regular Americans wanted something that was affordable, durable, and maybe, just maybe, a little more sophisticated than the bare bones Fords and Chevys that were being offered. And that is where the Plymouth came in. The Plymouth Model Q wasn't just Chrysler's first attempt at a low-cost car, it was the first Plymouth ever built. You could think of it as Chrysler's introduction to the American middle class. The first Plymouth Model Q rolled off the Highland Park assembly line on June 11, 1928, and was formally announced to the public about a month later. Technically, they called it a 1929 model. Prices started around $670, depending upon the body style. But that cost more than Ford and Chevrolet. However, you were getting more refinement for your money. In fact, their ads claimed that when it comes to dollar value, Plymouth is really the lowest price. And, I love this one, no other car gives you as much for your dollar. And guess what? The timing could not have been better. To start with, America was in the glow of the roaring 20s. People were buying cars at record rates. The Plymouth Model Q arrived just as buyers were ready for something maybe a little more advanced, but still within reach. And then, when the Great Depression hit the following year, well, Plymouth managed to hang on thanks to that combination of affordability and engineering quality. Before we walk around and take a look at the styling in our 1928 Plymouth Model Q, I want to show you this 1928 Ford Model AR business coupe that we have here at the museum. And there's some important things that I want to point out about the styling of this. To start with, take a look at the way this fender comes down at a pretty steep angle. Also, look at the height of this car. It's pretty tall. I also want to point out the gas tank right here. Now, when we swing over and we head over to our Plymouth Model Q that is right across the way, the first thing I want you to take a look at is the angle and the slope of the fender coming back. Starts here, goes all the way back. It doesn't actually meet the running board until right about at the door. That's the kind of touch, styling touch, that you would see in luxury cars of the day. So it was definitely flashier looking. Up front, in many ways, it was very standard, just the usual upright grille. And of course, we have the Plymouth logo right here. Not accidental that they chose Plymouth, standing for Plymouth Rock. They wanted it to be a symbol of American strength and durability. This is a car built by Americans, for Americans, in that American tradition. Some styling touches up on top. Notice the way it's got a little extra bit. Now this has been painted two-tone, but it's got a little more styling even back on the cowl. Once again, from the side though, at first glance, it would seem very standard for 1928. Artillery style wheels. You could get a variety of different models. There was a roadster, a coupe, a sedan, even a business coupe for traveling salesmen who needed extra space for samples or luggage. This was the rumble seat edition. This is how you would get in. You would first step onto this right here. I like that, by the way, that stylized P right there. Step number 2, and then you step right into there. And once you were there, what did you get? You got a lot of dust and you got a lot of fumes. Remember, as you were riding down on those dirt roads back in the day, there was an awful lot of dust that was kicked up. So, while it may seem romantic to ride around on the back of a rumble seat, back then it probably wasn't that great. One thing this car had that the Ford didn't have is a gas tank in the back. Remember, the Ford in 1928 had it up on the cowl. This had it at the very back of the car. Another thing that was different between the Plymouth and the Ford and Chevy of its day is the Plymouth had a slightly longer wheelbase, which was actually nicer in terms of a smoother ride. So they were thinking luxury, once again, at an affordable price. Now, one thing I do not know is why they call this the Plymouth Model Q. I remember this was the very first Plymouth. Where did they come up with Q? And the funny thing is the next one is called the Plymouth Model U. So where did they decide to start it at the very end? If somebody knows the answer to that, I'd love to know it. But most people back then simply called it a Plymouth. All right, let's take a closer look at the engine in our 1928 Plymouth Model Q. And while Plymouth was a brand new make for Chrysler, the reality is this is not a brand new engine. This engine actually traces its roots back to a car company called Maxwell. You might remember the story we did about Maxwell here in the museum. Well, Maxwell was absorbed with Walter P. Chrysler to become the roots of the Chrysler Motor Corporation. They used the tools, they used the assets to create Chrysler. And he also hung on to that four-cylinder engine that was powering the Maxwell. They used the foundation of that engine to build this one. Now, this engine is 170 cubic inches and it creates about 45 horsepower. That Maxwell engine wasn't quite as good as this one. They did some changes, some modifications to it. Did a number of things. They improved the carburation, they improved the ignition, they improved the lubrication. They did a lot of things to make this a stronger, better engine. The result is this makes 45 horsepower compared to the Maxwell engines that were making 38 or maybe 40 horsepower. This is a traditional engine for its day. It is what they call a flathead or side valve, L-head, depending upon what you want to call it, meaning that the piston is here and the valve is here as opposed to an overhead valve engine where the valves are up on top. So you look at the spark plugs here and then the valves would be just to the other side of that. This is what we call an updraft engine, meaning where the carburetor is down below, blowing the air up into the manifold, then going into it, like the big klaxon horn underneath the hood as well. But very standard in a lot of ways, but this engine would only last for a few years because in 1933, Plymouth came out with its own six-cylinder engine to compete with the one that Chevrolet was producing. Inside, the Model Q was simple, but it was a touch of elegance, not a lot. Just enough to make you know that you paid a little bit more and so you got a little bit more. Standard steel dashboard. Of course, you've got some fairly large gauges. You know, you got a barrel type speedometer. You had the amperage and the oil right there. No gas gauge. I love the Plymouth logo that's sitting right in front. One interesting thing is you look out though, it's amazing to think of how small this windshield is. It's very tiny. You know, if you want to look up, you kind of have to lean forward to make that happen. Had a throttle still on the steering wheel. Of course, you also had a foot pedal as well down there, but throttles on the steering wheel were still the norm. But here's the thing that really gave this car a leg up on everybody else. This car was using four-wheel hydraulic brakes. You got to remember, the Ford at the time was simply using mechanical brakes. And while mechanical brakes did the job, they stopped the car, they didn't stop it as evenly or as smoothly. More importantly, the hydraulic brakes were safer. So this car was designed to appeal to somebody who wanted a little bit more than the absolute most basic car. You got to remember, when this came out in the roaring 20s, people were starting to have a little bit more money. So the idea was to give them something just a touch above what you were going to get in the Ford or perhaps in the Chevrolet, especially the Ford, I should point out. So this is exactly what they wanted, a car that was inexpensive, but not the cheapest thing out there. Had just a touch of what you could get if you got into a bigger, more expensive car. In 1928, Plymouth sold more than 58,000 Model Qs. In fact, when the Model Q debuted at Madison Square Garden at the auto show, Chrysler dealers could hardly keep up with the demand. Now, having said that, it was still a long way from the competition. Chevrolet in 1928 sold more than 1 million Series AB Nationals that year. Ford didn't have quite as much sales as Chevrolet, but that's because it was a transition year from the Model T to the Model A. But Plymouth really became an important part of the Chrysler ladder of cars. It was really big in helping Chrysler survive the Depression, as a matter of fact. And when this Plymouth was sold in 1949, 21 years later, Plymouth was selling more than 800,000 cars a year. And when this outrageous Plymouth Superbird was built in 1970, Plymouth sold a total of more than 750,000 cars that year. Production for Plymouth peaked in 1973 with nearly 1 million sold. Unfortunately, the numbers started to slide with foreign competition on the lower range. From 1990 on, Plymouth rarely exceeded 200,000 cars per year. And when Daimler-Benz merged with Chrysler in 1998, the new leadership saw little reason to keep a struggling, lower-tier brand alive. By 2001, after more than 70 years on the American roads, Plymouth was quietly discontinued. The final model, the Neon, marking the end of an era for one of Detroit's original people's cars. This Model Q might not be flashy by modern standards, but this represents something bigger. The moment that Chrysler proved that an affordable car didn't have to be basic. And in that way, you could say this Model Q was ahead of its time. Well, this is where it all started.